there's third parties creating content that gets propagated through these platforms. It gets consumed by the end user, and they get tricked into sending money to someone, into taking some sort of action that causes them financial harm, physical harm, whatever that might be, right? And again, in the context of this discussion, we're talking about scams,
right?
And the prevalency of that these days, and the ability to actually perpetrate. To plan, execute, and perpetrate these scams on social media platforms is at a scale that we've never seen before.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for taking some time today. We're going to spend a little bit of your time talking about how some of the federal regulations that are pending, how some of the court cases that have transpired or come down, and a couple of interesting facts from the FBI and about how that may impact the way business or way banks, financial institutions look at authorized fraud. So to start with, this scam legislation is moving forward and is about coordinated prevention across banks, payment networks, regulators, et cetera. How do you think some of this is going to change the way banks approach the way they go after fraud?
So good question. And first of all, thanks for taking the time with me as well too, Ken.
Sure.
And I think the legislation that was put forth that you're referring to is the Scam Act, bipartisan bill. From
there's a couple of those, and a lot of things trying to go through, and let's see what happens. But yeah, there's a directional trend here that seems to be going well.
Correct. And I think this Scam Act is more apropos, or the most apropos to a quarter in what we're trying to achieve here and how we're trying to enable banks to fight scams and to fight the wider fraud fight that they're fighting. But before we actually talk about, we'll say, the present, I want to take us to the past, almost about 30 years ago, which for you and I, I'm actually going to speak for me, Ken, is still, it's in the past, but it's not the too distant past. But in 1996, we had the Communications Decency Act that came out, and there's this section, and actually is Section 230, this piece of that act that it actually provides, and was originally intended for telecom providers, but it's the common carrier, we'll say, exemption, right? And it provides some form of liability protection for them for content that actually gets distributed on their quote unquote network, from them being liable for, say, third-party content or anything that gets sent through there, right? And it's morphed, or interpretations and some legal outcomes have sort of morphed over time around Section 230 to cover what is the newer age as you start to get social media platforms and you start to get internet platforms that are providing content out to the general public and them consuming that content. Sometimes consuming that content, there's also some content that might cause harm, right? Yeah. And what's happened is they've said, well, look, you also qualify for that liability exemption. I'm paraphrasing here to a certain extent. So any of you lawyers out there in the audience, please don't hold me to this. This is not legal advice. But essentially, these platforms, the Metas of the world, are not liable for third-party content that has been sent through their platform or generated on their platform that gets, for what happens from the consumption of that on the back end by their users, right? So if we then come back from time and we come fast forward to today, what's happening now is there's a ton of content that's being produced on there that are essentially a variety or types of scams. And I mean, we can talk about some of the other content that's produced on there, illegal material and whatnot, some horrific things that go on some of these platforms. But for the purposes of this conversation, there's third parties creating content that gets propagated through these platforms. It gets consumed by the end user, and they get tricked into sending money to someone, into taking some sort of action that causes them financial harm, physical harm, whatever that might be, right? And again, in the context of this discussion, we're talking about scams,
right? And
the prevalency of that these days, and the ability to actually perpetrate. To plan, execute, and perpetrate these scams on social media platforms is at a scale that we've never seen before, right? So coming back to the act itself, what the act is trying to do is it's trying to prevent and trying to protect some of, or shift some of that liability onto the content that's generated on those platforms. And some of the actual, so if you think about it from shifting liability upstream, and this is financial liability. So
Right.
downstream, you have the banks, who everyone seems to look at with a certain degree of maybe distaste or distrust, because I've been tricked into sending money to some sort of fraudster. Why didn't the bank do more? And the bank's saying, well, wait a minute, look upstream of us, right? Where did this propagate from, right? And then where did this flow through from? So the Scam Act has been proposed and actually put forth for consideration in Congress on the floor. And you have organizations like the ABA that are throwing their full form and support behind this, because of the fact that it can't just be the banks that are trying to fight this, right? It has to be a coordinated effort. And so if we think about, and again, as with anything with Congress, this is going to take some time to actually move through, get considered and move through, and even if it gets passed, we're talking years down the line. But I think historically, I have not really bought into the idea that something like a fraud reimbursement scheme or a scam reimbursement scheme, the way that we see in the UK with the PSR regulation, the way it's coming to Europe via ECB regs, I don't think it's coming to the US anytime soon. And a lot of that is because of Section 230. But now you see a confluence of events where you see this Scam Act coming through. And I think there's some interesting, we'll say, legal cases out there about Section 230 that maybe we can dive into later. But all of that is to say that the banks themselves now are saying, look, we want to fight this, but we need help. And if the Scam Act goes through, there's a big potential for us to, we'll say, have a bank and a social media platform coordinated event. Think consortium, think sharing information and sharing intelligence. Maybe they both put their collective financial and technical might together to actually stop these acts from being perpetrated both upstream and then downstream if you can't catch them upstream.
Yeah, and I think, financial institutions, this may not pass, but the winds of change, right? They're blowing a little bit. They may not blow too strongly, if from the legislation perspective, but
that's right.
There's a direction that's coming out of this. And I think the part of the problem, you talk about the regulation or the laws protecting some of the platforms, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because they make a fair amount of money
that's right.
off advertising in general, a lot of money, and specifically on some of these cases that are fraud-related or worse. But from our perspective, the fraud-related side. So what's interesting, you mentioned the court case. So there was just a court case in Massachusetts that came out that may help break a little bit of that. Do you have a little bit of background?
Well, I do want to come back to maybe where you started with your question, which is like, hey, these platforms are, and we're talking about social media platforms, are being incentivized
the wrong way,
revenue or a way, right? Whether it's right or wrong, I think is up for deliberation. But it's just their business model, right? So, and show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes, right? So it will take. And this is not to say that there's not an altruistic motive to stopping content from being produced that's harmful in a variety of different ways on these sites. It's not to say that these sites these platforms don't want to stop those things. But there's, beyond societal pressure and the odd, congressman running for re-election, right? There's not really too much that's by way of a forcing mechanism to get them to update. And to get them to, at scale, actually stop and prevent some of these things. They try their best. As a former practitioner, as a former financial crime practitioner, I can tell you that it's not that the folks don't want to stop some of this behavior. It's challenging from a resource perspective. And again, show me the incentives and show me the outcomes, and I'll show you the outcomes. But yeah, you mentioned recent, we'll say, verdict that was handed down. And we come back to sort of YouTube and Meta in this regard. And while it wasn't necessarily geared towards the outcome, was geared towards a financial impact or implication that happened to an individual. It was more around material that was being produced on their website. The consumption of that and the ultimate actions by the end user, the platform was found liable. Right. And the rationale, or the legal rationale behind that, was negligent product design. Right? And it says it right there in the outcome of the case law: negligent product design. And ultimately, they decided they favored on the side of the plaintiffs for a couple $1 million. And you might say, well, what does this have to do with financial crime? What does this have to do with scams? It has to do the world with it, because the implications of this are now, okay, if I can hold, and let's come back to my original response on my original sort of where we started this conversation around Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act and the liability shield that these platforms have historically had for that content. Well, that's now been sort of slashed, right, with this legal interpretation of this legal outcome. Now, of course, it can still go to appeals court and it can still get overturned. But I think it's the first real indication of, we'll say, the legal system combining forces with the social system to say, there's harmful content being produced here, we need to hold these folks liable. And then honestly, if I'm a bank exec in the background, I'm thinking, finally, right? Everyone's always railing on the banks and why don't you do more? Money came out of my system, money came out of my account. Or law enforcement, why aren't you doing more against CSAM or other like terrible materials they could produce on these sites, right? But it's always been stop and go in terms of folks looking at the platforms and saying, look, you have to do your part here too. Now the courts are saying, Section 230 be damned a bit, we're going to start to hold you accountable for these things. And the impact on that downstream is now if I produce a fraudulent investment scam, right, or a fraudulent crypto scam, right, which we all know. Yeah, maybe there is or maybe there isn't crypto scams out there. I don't know. But if I produce one of those and I put that on X, we'll pick on X for a little bit, or I put that on some other social media platform. As you can see, I'm not a social media savant, right? Maybe I throw that on LinkedIn. It's an investment scam.
Yeah.
I'm going to hold LinkedIn liable for that if Ken gets scammed out of that investment and loses funds, right? And then there's reimbursement mechanisms that need to be considered. So now we start to, it's almost like the UK and the EU start to look at us and say, guys, we've been at this for a few years. Now you should start to consider this as well too. We're like, finally, now people start to turn and say, hey, the US is starting to think about the implications of this and all the players involved, particularly upstream of the fraudulent activity that happens. So it's super interesting to me.
So let's bring this back to some numbers. So the new FBI report just came out, just dropped.
Yeah, the IC3 report.
Right, yep. And it, $20 billion in internet-related, $21 billion in internet-related fraud, and 80 or 90% of that was kind of in areas that we talk about with scams and authorized fraud and romance scams, investment scams. Some sort
of cyber-enabled fraud, right?
Right. And so that all, that report has come out, I don't know, for how many years? And what was it, like you mentioned earlier, like $1 billion? I don't know, a few years ago?
I think about a decade ago, the total of the report was $1 billion, right? So that was 10 years ago. We've now jumped up to 20 billion.
20 billion.
10 years.
And of that 20 billion, when they report 20 billion,
2021.
You think about what authorized fraud, how much of authorized fraud doesn't ever get reported.
Yep.
We're looking, I don't know if it's the tip of the iceberg, but we're not looking at the full iceberg when we get numbers like that. So there's a significant amount of additional fraud that happens that people don't report.
Correct.
That's silent, quiet fraud that's going on that we don't see from reports like that. So, we see some of the legislation that's happening. We see some court cases that are happening. We see numbers that would be scary if I were running a fraud department at a major bank, right, or a credit union. So what do you think, how should those folks be looking at this from their fraud strategy when it's gone from, 1 billion, probably in their recent careers, up to $20 billion, and the fraud detection capabilities haven't gotten that much, you haven't improved that much over the last few years, which is why we're here talking about what Accruer can do.
Right.
What is it that, how should these folks be looking at their fraud strategies going forward?
Well, I first start with the numbers. So before I think about a plan to deal with this, you first have to say, okay, let me look at the numbers and let me think about what is the actual impact to me, if there is any. Right. And when I first look at the numbers, I say, okay, I went from 1 billion a decade ago to 20 billion. What's driving that? And historically, folks who have listened to Accruer talk about this shift in landscape, not just the regulatory paradigm shift with authorized reimbursement that's happening in some of the regions, but the shift in how fraud is perpetrated against the community at large, against the end user. We've seen a massive shift from about 2022 onwards. Historically, it's always been unauthorized fraud, right? And I am going to get to how the banks approach this and how should they be thinking about this to a portion of your earlier question. But historically, it's been unauthorized fraud. So I've had to stop unauthorized fraud, right? I have to stop someone from gaining access to my account. And banks have almost looked at this as a quasi-cyber issue as well, too, in terms of InfoSec. Someone getting access to my account through some way, shape, or form, someone getting access to my information and then using that to move money out of my account.
And they've gotten really pretty good at that. I mean,
they've been very good at that, right? And the numbers reflect that. Like 1 billion is still not a number, a small figure, right? But it's accelerated, right, at a hockey stick kind of rate. So how do we get to 20 billion? And that's because about 4 years ago-ish, a complete shift in terms of how fraud is actually perpetrated. You know, you got the 80-20, the Pareto rule, right? It's maybe 80% of fraud used to be unauthorized, 20%, maybe a little less authorized. It's now complete inverse of that, right? Where 80% plus of scams that are perpetrated, you still have unauthorized type fraud, like ATO and things like that. And now you've got this massive authorized fraud shift, scams perpetrated, and then you have a convergence of technology and the ability to actually, at scale and for less time, less money, try and perpetrate as much authorized fraud as I can. And I won't even try and go into like how that actually works and how that all gets prepared.
Right.
But that in and of itself is what's driving the increase in those numbers. And if we start to skim through the report, you can see some of the breadcrumbs around where the fingerprints of that type of activity or that shift evident in the report all over the place. So I say, okay, if I'm a bank exec reading that, I say, okay, there's been a shift, right? In why are the numbers that size? There's been this shift. Am I prepared for that? And the preparation is normally one of, well, I'm going to get questions about this. I'm going to get questions about how I'm going to protect the institution given this new threat that's coming. And historically, my entire program, from my technology all the way down to what I call my ways of working, my operational processes, have all been authorized or have all been, we'll say, constructed around trying to detect signals, trying to operationally deal with unauthorized fraud. Now I have to rethink that, right? And then I take this 20 billion number and I combine it with the fact that maybe actual reimbursement schemes aren't as far away in the U.S. as I thought they were. And I'd be the first to tell you that I still think we're years away from having like serious deliberation about it. But I didn't think it would come this soon. And the recent legislation introduced, the recent outcome of the court case around liability, those would all have me thinking, okay, regardless, I need to start to form some sort of strategy around this, right? If reimbursement were to come, what's my exposure there? Do I even know what I don't know about a scams problem or the fraud that's actually attacking my institution? So that's probably where I start. I think dig into this report. Bank practitioners are going to look at this report. Fraud program owners are going to look at this report and say, okay, what are the attack vectors that are really causing the most, say, financial exposure that I have? What's mine? They already have a good handle on, or at least a decent handle on, where are my fraud attack vectors right now? And then, okay, maybe I don't have a problem there because that tends to be the biggest financial impact is a crypto-related scam. I don't offer crypto, I don't have a problem. No, you kind of do because your end users are going onto crypto platforms and they're moving money off of that and moving it through your bank, right? So
or mules.
Or mules, right?
Yeah.
Whether they know it or they
exactly.
don't, they might be moving it through your institution as well too. So whenever someone says I have no crypto exposure, I'm always like, you do, right? But let's argue about that over drinks. So bank practitioners are going to start to look at this and layer it into their existing setup and say, do I have the right controls? Where's my current exposure? Maybe I don't know what I don't know about my existing exposure, so maybe I have to pressure test some of those. Maybe I need to dig deeper into and do a little more analytical digging into historical figures around all sorts of data points that I have of money flowing through my bank, of end user activity. And they need to start to not think about this as a transaction problem or a behavioral problem or an identity problem. They need to start to think about this as what's actually happening in my end users' accounts How do I have visibility into that? How do I track that on an ongoing basis? Because if I'm going to be held to account to reimburse for these things, I want to know money moving in and money moving out. I want to know everything about my client, and you can't do that if you're just looking at one portion of their activity within your institutions.
Right.
I'm not saying that they don't have great programs or great technology behind that, and I'm not even saying they have to necessarily get rid of those. I'm saying that there's a fundamental strategic shift, a wow shift in terms of how you work and how you set up your teams to deal with this. And there's potentially a much larger financial implication than you ever thought there would be. It is a sit up and take notice point. And I think that's where we're at right now.
Right.
Maybe that inflection point comes if that legislation gets deliberated on the floor this year or next year. If that legal ruling, if that court outcome gets upheld in appeals court, right? If the FTC, if the OCC look at this IC3 report and start to bake that into their exam procedures and their expectations of the banks, then that sit up and take notice moment that we're having right now, then that starts to become an inflection point for these folks.
Okay, great. Well, good. Well, Chris, thank you very much. Appreciate the time today.
Thanks, Ken.